tonight with the New Zealand Association of Rationalists and Humanists for this public talk with Aaron Ra and Matt Dillon. So, just a couple of thanks in order. Thanks for for both of you for coming down here. It's really appreciated. Don't really get many people like you down here from the American atheist community often, so it's a real pleasure. Second thanks comes to the New Zealand Association for Rationalists and Humanists for helping to organise this. It's really appreciated. Third thanks comes for one of the members of the Reason and Science Society committee who can't be here today, who's Joshua Gilbert, for organising the talk as well. And so to start off with, we'll be having Aaron Ra speaking for around 40 minutes. And then we'll have a 10-minute break set up for the next speaker, Matt Dillahunty. And then we'll have a 5-minute break before we have Q&A, which will go on at most for around until 8:45 p.m. Just a note as well, just over there I'm pointing, that's where you can sign up to be a member of the Reason and Science Society. You can just write down your details, and there's just a $2 membership fee to notify you about events we'll be having for the rest of the semester. And we also have a Facebook group as well, at Reason and Science Society Auckland on Facebook too, as well as if you want to check out our content, we also have a YouTube channel under the same name too. So, thank you. Aaron Ra.
Thank you very much. Friedrich Nietzsche once said that one of my favorite quotes from him was that faith was not wanting to know what is true. And one of his contemporaries, Mark Twain, also the pen name for Samuel Clemens, said that faith is believing what you know ain't so. And when I first got into arguing against theism, religious ideas, I wouldn't have believed either of these, but after my experience of doing that for decades now, I've come to realize that either or both of these men got it right, depending on which believer you're talking about. Now, I actively started countering creationism shortly, right around Y2K, and at that time there was a charlatan named Kent Hovind who was calling himself Dr. Dino. Now, he had no discernible education or relevant expertise, but he declared himself to be an expert on dinosaurs, even though, like so many young Earth creationists, he referred to dinosaurs as dragons. He's been in prison for the last decade or so for tax fraud, but before his arrest, he was offering a $250,000 prize for anybody that could produce evidence of evolution. And all the creationists were spreading this around, showing scientists, saying, if you think you have evidence of evolution, then why hasn't anybody answered Dr. Hovind's challenge? And just jeering science with this. And this is a pretty good question, because the mere fact that humans are classified as a subset of apes, complete with, morphologically and genetically, complete with the conserved yet dysfunctional monkey genes. This is one of many examples of a body of facts that is exclusively concordant with and thus supportive of that one conclusion over any other, and that's exactly what evidence is. But creationists use a different dictionary. And if you click the link to answer Hovind's challenge, the next page of his website said that they wouldn't accept what everyone else would understand as being evidence of evolution, that what he was demanding instead was proof that God couldn't have done it. So it was a bait and switch to a completely different challenge, a nonsense challenge with no acceptable answer. Hovind set it up so that no one could win, no matter what evidence they had or how good it was, and so that he wouldn't have to admit when anybody even tried, so that it looked like nobody had answered at all. So it looked like the scientists all knew that they didn't really have anything. So this challenge was completely deceptive, deliberately deceptive, but what else could you expect from a convicted fraud using a store-bought degree as a fake ID? And I saw him in debate, and somebody debating Dr. Hovind, who paid $100 for his PhD, by the way. What are you guys doing in college when you can go about it so easily? One of his opponents had predicted what Hovind would ask for evidence of. And this guy produced a stack of peer-reviewed articles addressing that challenge. Hovind dismissed them all without a glance in an instant by saying, "That's not evidence, that's just a bunch of paper." The same thing happened in the court case of Kitzmiller versus Dover. Michael Behe, on trial, or on stand, said that science would never be able to produce a scientific explanation for the evolution of the immune system. He was presented with 58 books and peer-reviewed articles addressing exactly that, providing a scientific explanation. And he, again, dismissed it all in a moment, saying that it wasn't good enough to address his question. And of course, he couldn't give a reason as to why, and certainly couldn't address any one of them. How could he known that? I don't think he did. But as a defender of the faith, he is not allowed to admit any error, not when he's determined to defend the keystone argument of intelligent design. And I experienced the same thing last month. I had a conversation on my channel with a dinosaur denier. Someone who says that dinosaurs never existed and were in fact a hoax created by big science. She said that if we find the fossils of an elephant, we would know that an elephant was there because elephants exist today and are therefore absolute. I'm not sure exactly what she meant by that. She said that new species are found all the time and fossils can be formed very, very quickly. So if we find the bones that we think are a dinosaur, then maybe it's just some other gigantic animal that's still alive and somehow nobody's seen them. This is especially funny when you consider the number of dinosaur fossils that are found in open spaces of Montana, and where the hell are you going to have something that big hiding? And I think she thought that if you didn't have a live dinosaur to look at, that you wouldn't know how the bones went together. And she didn't know that there was ways of identifying the bones themselves. And she didn't know that we had fully articulated, complete dinosaur skeletons. And I showed her a picture of one. It was a lithograph of Sinornithosaurus. And she tried to dismiss it by saying that it looked like a bird. Well, of course it would, wouldn't it? And I've heard the same argument used to try to dismiss Microraptor. Because if it looks like a bird, then it's a bird and not a dinosaur, no matter how many dinosaur traits it has, unless it's a pterosaur, and in which case it's both a dinosaur and a bird without being either one. And when you're determined to reject something, you'll use any excuse that works. Okay. In each case, when a creationist is cornered on a pivotal point, they cannot make an honest concession because they don't care what the truth is. In one way or other, I have seen many times an admission to the effect that whether we believe it matters more than whether it is true. Their position, and I'm not kidding about this, their position is not about truth. It's about appearances. And it's not demonstrated by fact, but by a demonstration of conviction. And really, it's about make-believe. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not. There's an emotional attachment to religious beliefs. That's why they require apologists, people whose job it is to make up whatever excuse is necessary to rationalize or justify whatever they need in order to preserve a preferred belief. And even when that belief is obviously wrong, a religious apologist has a doctrinal obligation to defend the faith and make people believe. And that includes pulling the wool over your own eyes, too. You're supposed to reaffirm your faith using a cognitive bias and a logical fallacy of a circular argument routing back to an assumed conclusion. And why would anybody be so determined to preserve or promote a belief rather than investigating it to make sure that it's correct? I've often met people who say that they don't care what the facts are. They're going to believe what they want to believe. And if I try to tell them what the facts are, then they get angry, saying, why can't I believe what I want to believe? As if it was a matter of choice. And they tell me that I have that choice too, but I don't. Whatever I believe is a condition determined by my knowledge of the facts and will obligately change along with my understanding of the information. I have no choice in the matter, and if I did, I wouldn't believe as I do. I wouldn't believe as they do either, because if I have to believe in a fantasy world, I can imagine much better ones than they have. The reasons they give for believing as they do could not compel me to believe it too. For example, Ken Ham of Answers in Genesis says that you have to believe in the first half of the Bible where it talks about creation in order to believe in the second half of the Bible where it talks about salvation. He wants to believe in salvation, so he'll make believe creation. And he describes something very similar to that when he talks about looking at evidence through God glasses, which is another way of describing confirmation bias, where you simply don't admit anything that stands against you and you only reaffirm those things that you think you can rationalize to make sense for your position. And logically that means it's all make-believe and not a sincere belief. That's a self-inflicted delusion called pretending. Well, it's not always self-inflicted. It's usually indoctrinated from early childhood. When a child's mind is most susceptible to cultural conditioning, norms of fidelity are imposed such that children are trained to execrate conflicting ideas, not to consider them, but to react to them and to reject them no matter what. They're taught never to question their beliefs, only to preserve and defend the faith, and they'll do that with apologetics, semantics, distorted data, emotional pleas, and sometimes violence. Worst of all, their conditioning is so ingrained that most never question why they needed to defend a belief at all. If you're honest and you make reasonable estimates based on the fact at hand that this is probably what happened, then your critics will attack you for being uncertain, as if that somehow means you're wrong. You said probably. That means you don't really know. And obviously you people are not as familiar with Texans as I am, but that's the way they talk. And your critics, however, will claim absolute certainty, even without any evidence at all to back it up. Oh, I don't just believe it. I know it. And that's the most irritating thing about religion, pretending to know what you don't know. And it's especially bad when it's something that no one really can know. The difference between knowledge and mere belief is that knowledge is demonstrable with measurable accuracy, meaning that it can be tested. It doesn't matter how convinced you are. If you can't show that you're right, then we can't know that you're right, and neither can you, really. If you're making an extraordinary claim, then your word, simply because you say so, isn't good enough. If you can't confirm your accuracy to any degree at all by any means whatsoever, then it is a fact that you cannot honestly say that you know what you think you know. So don't say, "I know it for a fact," like so many of my countrymen do. Because a fact is a point of data that is either not a dispute or is indisputable in that it is objectively verifiable, and that is never the case with religious beliefs. If you can't give us a reason to believe you, then we have no reason to believe you. And having no reason to believe something is a pretty good reason not to believe it. Although there are other reasons too. And every time someone realizes that they don't really have the facts to show, then they shift the argument to, well, it's just common sense. But of course, they're not using common sense. They're using assumptions based on ignorance. In other words, they don't know what they're talking about. And this applies to every apologist of any religion. They don't know what they say they know. And imagine a gathering of the leaders of the top dozen or so religions and religious denominations all gathered around saying that they have the absolute truth and that everybody else is wrong. Logically, only one of them, at most, even could be absolutely correct. And it is infinitely more likely that they are all at least partially wrong, and the dominant probability is that they're all completely wrong. None of them can show that their beliefs are any more accurate than anyone else's, because none of them can show that there's any truth to any of their assertions whatsoever, and that's all that really matters. It isn't truth just because you say it is. It doesn't matter what we call the truth. It only matters what we can show that the truth really is. Truth is commonly defined as that which is concordant with reality. So reality itself is not truth. But statements about reality can be, if they're true. So how do we go about determining whether a statement is in concordance with reality? When a witness takes the stand and swears to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, Do we assume that everything they say from that point is the truth just because they said so? It becomes the job of the court to determine whether that is the truth. And the way they determine that is by determining whether it is true. So, the truth is what the facts are. Whatever statement can be shown to be true. Consequently, there is no truth to any religious belief. Conversely, if you have no faith at all and rely on scientific data instead, then you actually can show that what you believe really is true. You can show the truth of it. You can show the truth of evolution, for example. But that fact enrages your opponents, whom prompts them to solipsism. The only way to defend beliefs that are not concordant with reality is to challenge reality itself. So every time I've argued with apologists, it always starts out the same way. They can't address the facts, so they attack epistemology. It is as if their position is so weak that God couldn't be real unless reality isn't. Case in point, when my friend Matt Dillahunty recently debated Matt Slick, Dillahunty conceded up front that he's only assuming that his knowledge of reality is real and that it's not just an illusion. So Slick couldn't get any purchase with that argument, and instead argued that chose the Exodus to name as a fact, which he said indicated a divine being. However, I had debated Slick myself only a week or so earlier, and I told him that if we both agree that reality is real by definition, then the Exodus is not a fact, and we can show that it actually never happened. The Slick responded to that exactly the way I predicted he would. He told me that I couldn't prove anything because I couldn't prove that I existed 2 weeks ago, because I might have been manufactured since then, complete with false memories. That, of course, is an argument that reality is wrong, because all our knowledge of reality might be false memories deceptively implanted. And this sort of apologist can't claim to know anything if we know anything. So they say that you have to know everything before you can know anything, which is a rule that they don't apply to themselves. They can show that they know nothing and still claim to be better informed than all the best educated expert specialists anywhere ever. So get them to agree up front that you both live in the same reality, that reality is real, and that it will remain so even if they're losing the argument. Scientists can't waste their time imagining that life is but a dream. They have to live in the real world, and they have to distinguish what they know from what they merely believe. Even their beliefs have to be backed by evidence, because nobody cares what you believe. All that matters is why you believe it. It should be objective, meaning that whatever reason convinced you should also convince me too and anyone else also. There has to be a reason, and it has to be one that is really true. Scientists can't postulate anything without a reason. They can't even say that something is probably true until they have the evidence indicating that probability. And they can't say that something is true unless their evidence is so strong as to constitute proof. And obviously here I'm using the legal definition where proof is defined as an overwhelming preponderance of evidence. But religious people don't abide by those rules. Every claim religion makes falls into one of two categories: not evidently true and evidently not true. So the guy with no knowledge of anything whatsoever, who has already been proven wrong on every single point, will still declare that he knows for a fact that he's right, and people will believe him because he seems so confident. But he's being dishonest because he's claiming facts that are not facts. Don't tell me that he might be right and we can't prove he's not, and therefore we can't call him a liar. No. It is dishonest to assert as fact that which is not evidently true, and I'll give you an example of that. Let's say you go to an elementary school when they're closing out, just before they let out the students, when all the parents pull up in their cars to pick up their kids. And you go tell the principal that there's a man in one of those cars with a gun. Now, how's the school going to respond? They're going to call the police, and the police are going to come ask you which car. Don't try to reverse the burden of proof. Don't tell the cops that they have to go search every one of those cars to prove there's not a man with a gun out there. Because it doesn't work like that. I come from Texas, where anybody can have a concealed weapon, and many people do. The probability is there's going to be more than one guy out there with a gun. Sadly, that's really true. But it wouldn't matter if there is somebody out there with a gun, because if they find out that you told them this without any evidence, then you're still in trouble for lying to the police and filing a false alarm. Now, that's not to say that these people are always conscious of their dishonesty. I'm sure there are many people who sincerely believe because they've never questioned their beliefs or because everyone else believes it, so it must be true. Curiously, though, they don't grieve any differently than we do. And what happens when you challenge that belief? Cause them to analyze it, possibly for the first time. How do they respond to that? And how would you respond? And wouldn't it be different? Put yourself in their shoes. And I would assume that most of the people in this audience are apistivists, meaning that you don't believe anything on faith. That you're rational, skeptical, secular atheists who tentatively trust empirical science. So how would you respond when some devotee of dogmatism tells you that essentially everything you know is wrong? Because that's what both camps are telling each other, but they're perceiving this and reacting to it differently. For one thing, non-believers don't become offended or intimidated by finding out that someone believes differently. If someone comes and tells me that they think Benjamin Franklin discovered America and was our first king, I'm going to correct that guy. And I'm going to treat his error exactly the same way I would religion. Yes, they have the right in free countries to believe in utter horseshit, as long as they keep it to themselves. Otherwise, their right to be wrong conflicts with my right to be right. And I was never a creationist myself. I've always understood evolution and deep time ever since I was a little kid, although I was all alone in that. This may seem alien for New Zealand, but I did not meet a non-creationist until I was a teenager. I had an atheist teacher in middle school when I was 13 or so, who was the first person I had ever met who didn't believe in Noah's flood. And my first step to critical thinking was when this teacher told me that there was never any global flood, nor could there have been, and it didn't really take much thought to realize he was right. When I was a boy, I believed in Noah's Ark. I believed in God and Jesus. I believed in psychic powers, pyramid power, Bigfoot, past life remembrance, and the Nazca lines from the chariots of the gods. I stopped believing in the flood when I was 13, but I still bought into a bunch of other bullshit that everybody else I knew believed in too. In fact, I was so gullible back then that I could have qualified as a Ghostbuster. You remember that scene where the receptionist is interviewing the new recruit? She says, "Do you believe in UFOs, astral projection, mental telepathy, ESP, clairvoyance, spirit photography, telekinetic movement, full trance mediums, the Loch Ness Monster, and the theory of Atlantis?" When that movie came out, I believed in all that stuff. But I noticed when I was about 12 years old that only certain books ever mentioned any of those things, and the accounts that they gave were inconsistent, unverifiable, and unreliable. Mainstream science sources never backed any of it up. Science books never mentioned the flood, nor the miracles of Jesus, and they never gave credence to cryptozoology, parapsychology, psionic ability, or the possibility of investigating the ethereal plane out of body according to transcendental meditation. And I liked believing in all these science fiction topics because they made existence interesting. That's why we have so many movies about that sort of thing. So I had a thought that maybe I would just read those books that I knew would bolster or reaffirm what I wanted to believe. And as soon as I thought that, I instantly realized how dishonest that would be. And why would I want to believe something that probably wasn't true? And when I ask this of religious believers, I usually only get cold stares. I can't imagine being afraid of an idea, or worse, being afraid that someone else might be right and I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, wouldn't I want to know about that as soon as possible? But I've actually heard people say, if believing in God is wrong, I don't want to be right. Accurate information has practical application, and a faulty premise will lead to faulty conclusions. So I resigned to investigate everything and question my own assumptions and only believe those things that could survive reasonable scrutiny. I suspect that a lot of other people have come to this crossroads and made the opposite choice. And that other choice inspires very different psychology and behavior. As gullible as I was, I thought I had reasons to believe the things that I did. I'd seen those films black marketed in from beyond the Iron Curtain of the Russians experimenting with telekinesis. I'd seen a submarine photograph of the flipper of a plesiosaur in Loch Ness. And I saw spiritual life force evidenced in Curlian photography when I was watching what I thought was a science documentary. So I didn't believe anything on faith. Rather, I was a naive kid who was deceived by, fooled by deceptive media. And I was outraged at that. How could they show things on TV that weren't really true? It was like, didn't anybody vet these things? And I'm offended when I discover that someone has lied to me. And I think we all should be. I understand that people lie, and sometimes there are desperate situations in which you have to lie. I would say the same thing about violence. To me, lies and violence are both the same thing. They are both damaging and should be reserved for the last resort. But among creationists, lying is a means to an end, and the ends justify the means. So it's okay to lie if you're lying for Jesus. In fact, I was on a live talk radio show with conservative Christian Scott Sloan when he said that there's nothing wrong with lying to people if they don't know you're lying. Which I thought was a stunning admission, and he didn't seem to see the gravity of that because he continued to bury his foot in his mouth. He said that, there was a specific example that he gave was his own children. He said if his children said that they wanted to go to Disneyland and he didn't want to listen to them nag, that he would put them in the car and they would go drive to some abandoned building, telling him that they're going to go to Disneyland. And when they get to the abandoned building, he would just say, oops, they're closed, and go home. According to him, there's nothing wrong with that. Betraying their trust, misleading them that way. He may think that ignorance is bliss, but I think knowledge is power. And so truth matters more than whatever I would rather believe. So as each of my woo beliefs were shown to be false, all of them in turn, one after the other, I discarded them until I had no more. But I can show examples where the faithful have been proven wrong and continue to believe anyway. Believers sometimes say, I'm not going to change your mind and you're not going to change mine. And that may be true in some occasions, but not always. And it's important to understand why. Because someone can change my mind if they're right. There'd be a way to show it, and I would change my mind because I'm an honest person. But faith-based beliefs are held regardless of evidence and will not change because of it. So it doesn't matter if you can prove that you're right. They're never going to accept it. And I thought that everyone believed whatever they do for a reason. I was shocked when I finally started probing into what people believe and why to find out that there was a lot of people who didn't have a reason and didn't want one. They believed in books they wouldn't read because it made them feel good, because they had a sense of community in their church, because their lover or their parents were religious, or because it would mean that they would get along better at work or at school. These are not reasons to believe. These are reasons to pretend to believe. There's only one reason why anyone should believe anything. It is because investigation consistently shows that it is evidently, at least probably true. The way I see it, there are those who have this desperate need to believe, and there are those who have instead a desire to understand. It didn't used to be a dichotomy, but it's getting to be that way. The demographics is shifting. It used to be that the average person held some notion of the supernatural and at least a belief in their own soul. And that most people knew that you had to accept science as a matter of fact. But that middle-of-the-road demographic is disappearing. Religion is in a general state of decline, even in the United States. But American statistics show that creationism is on the rise. And it already accounts for about half the American population. Now, the only way that both of these statistics can be true at the same time is if science-savvy people are abandoning religion altogether, which is fine. But religious people are also abandoning science entirely and are headlines regularly show what a disaster that is, especially when we're talking about children who are dying because parents are trying to pray away what would have been easily treatable diseases. So we're left with two very different philosophies evoking completely different behaviors, which lead me to doubt whether the wanna-believers believe what they do in the same sense that I believe what I do. For example, I have no motivation to protect a belief, even if it might be wrong. And some of the faithful have described their faith, their belief, as a verb, as an act of will, of mind over matter, the power of positive thought, as if they can change reality if they can believe hard enough. So they may force themselves into a compromised situation in order to show their commitment to that belief, that it has to be true or else they're doomed. And this makes them believe much harder. And a good example of that is the little old ladies that throw their medication up on the stage trying to convince themselves that the faith healer has just cured them. And a few people have died in that. And then my favorite example of that is Robert Fitzpatrick. He was an American living in New York City, and he believed in Harold Camping's prediction that the world would end on May 21st, 2011. Because of some interpretation of what they thought was a biblical prophecy. Fitzpatrick showed his commitment to that belief by spending his entire life savings of $140,000 on bus ads and billboards advertising the end of the world. This shows complete commitment to that belief to the point that it absolutely has to be true or he's screwed. So he went to Times Square to count down to the end of the world, which was supposed to be at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. When the time came and went with no apocalypse in sight, he was confused why people were still alive, and what was he going to do now that he is still alive as a 60-year-old man who is now penniless. Creationism is a form of religious extremism requiring a degree of reality denial. So it makes a much better example than someone who claims to be a moderate or reasonable Christian based on how little of their faith they still cling to versus how much they now reject. So sticking with creationism as my example, let's look at the different behaviors which are most obvious when arguing against each other online. The one I most often see is where they project their own faults onto us, accusing us of having faith just like they do. So they evidently already understand that faith is a bad thing. And some of them have even admitted on public record that religious beliefs are pulled out of the air. I was stunned to see an admission like that. And they think that the scientific position is like that too, which I don't get. But my point is, we don't do that to them. We don't accuse them of using reason just like we do. We're objective, they're subjective, it's completely different. We tend to define our terms up front and show that we're using them correctly, but believers won't even permit definitions because they rely on double meanings and changing context in order to move the goalposts. We also tend to cite our sources and present the evidence to show that we got it right and that we're not remembering it incorrectly, and certainly not that we're making it up. However, the most infamous chairman of our Texas Board of Education addressed a Christian school wherein he told the students to keep chipping away at that empirical evidence. So it is very obviously about what they want to believe and not what is really true. One of his associates told me during a moderated debate that he knew there were transitional species, but that he wanted to teach students that there were none. Because, he said, it was important that they believe that there are none. So the most obvious, the most important difference is that willful believers will lie in defense of their beliefs without compunction. And I can't imagine any instance where a skeptic would need or want to do that, especially not as a teacher. Neither would we need to misrepresent our position. And my favorite example of that is Ray Comfort. As an American atheist addressing a New Zealand audience, I have to say thanks for sending us Ray Comfort. He is a street preacher who's had people explaining evolution to him every day for decades, so he knows what the truth is. Yet, when he got on the 700 Club and was talking to Pat Robertson of the Christian Coalition, he described the evolution of the first dog as an amorphous mass of meat that sat around for millions of years, blind, until it suddenly grew eyes, legs, and a tail and turned into a dog. And then had to go look for another lump of meat that sat around for millions of years before it suddenly turned into a female of the same species. With no population genetics, no common ancestor. And he knows that's not evolution. But Comfort also knows that he has to create a straw man because he can't discredit evolution any honest way. We don't need to do as he does, nor would we want to. We can uncover any rock because we're not afraid of whatever truth lies therein. The best way to become an atheist is to read the Bible. The best way to parody the religious position is to let them speak for themselves. Often we don't have to do anything more than that, though I still encourage correcting their errors as a matter of public record. When someone tells me that I'm wrong and they can prove it, I'm all ears. You never learn more than when you realize that you're wrong, and it's better to be proven wrong than to remain wrong and never know it. But religious organizations all post a statement of faith wherein they admit in one way or another, and if you want to challenge me on this, just put down the name of any religious organization and then include in the search statement of faith, and you'll see it, where they in one way or another will admit that they believe what they do for reasons that have nothing to do with factual information, and where they will not change their minds or must not change their minds in light of any evidence, that they will not even consider evidence that they may be wrong. And that's why I say that theirs is the most dishonest position it is possible to have. So I came up with my own version of Dr. Dino's challenge. Several times I've told creationists that I will prove evolution to their satisfaction, and that I can't succeed unless they admit that I have. And there are some requirements, of course, but they're all reasonable and legitimate. It's all done in writing and with a set number of mutual exchanges in public archives. And before anybody asks me what is the secret, it's not like a word game. It's changes for everybody. It's a simple battery of questions to get them to think. I've discovered that it doesn't matter what you tell them. They can dismiss any point with the phrase, "That doesn't prove anything." And they can explain everything by explaining nothing, simply by saying, "That's how God did it." And they don't even have to know what you just said, as long as they can guess which of these two responses to use. So, one thing creationists will not do is be held accountable. Their belief depends on misunderstanding and misrepresenting evolution, and I know that. So my job is to get them to think, to understand what I'm saying, and to acknowledge certain learning points as we progress. This way, I can do this with a series of questions that they have to answer, and this keeps them actively engaged and doesn't allow them to reverse the burden of proof. The rule is that they will default the challenge if they repeatedly fail to answer direct questions, and I have several previous attempts archived online where I can show that that is exactly how they got out of it. One of those occasions is not available because I was arguing with somebody on his private blog and he deleted the entire conversation. In another post somewhere else, which I wasn't expected to find, I saw where he had explained why to one of his friends. He said he had to delete the entire conversation because he realized I was making sense. And he didn't want anyone else to know that. Most commonly, though, my challenge is simply refused. And I think it's because they already suspect that what they believe is not true, and they don't want to know that. They want to go on pretending that it is. In fact, my challenge was refused so vigorously, so often, that I began to think that if faith is defined only as a firm conviction or firm trust in the accuracy or trustworthiness of a given position, then I have faith and they don't. Most dictionaries will give the definition of faith in two contexts, that one and the religious context, which is a rigidly held belief that is not based on evidence. Among creationists, there are the deceived and deceivers and no third category. That doesn't mean that all creationists are liars. Some of the innocents don't know they're deceived and would rather not be. They may be honest people. But once they're immersed in this discussion, to hear the evidence and arguments on both sides, they will very quickly be faced with a choice, whether to remain honest or whether to remain creationist, because it will no longer be possible to be both. And it's interesting when the discussion gets to that final point, you can see them making that choice. They'll either start asking sincere questions, trying to make sure that this is really correct, or they'll start obfuscating, projecting, ducking and dodging and showing other signs that they don't want to know what is really true. They'd rather believe what they know ain't so. Such is the nature of faith. Thank you.